Hello everyone. My name's Adrian Collette. I'm Vice Principal Engagement here at the University of Melbourne, and I'd like to welcome you most warmly here to launch and celebrate Christos Tsiolkas' important new book, Christos Tsiolkas on Patrick White, which is the latest in our series, Writers on Writers. Importantly, we published this in partnership with Black Ink Publishing. I think I saw Maury here, Maury Schwartz. Welcome, Maury. And also with the State Library of Victoria, and welcome to Justine Hyde. In welcoming you, I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the land of the Wurundjeri, and pay my respect to their elders and to their families. And I acknowledge also that the Wurundjeri have been telling and sharing their stories on this land for literally thousands of generations. Christos Tsiolkas is an alumnus of the Faculty of Arts, so it's a particular pleasure to invite you back to this wonderful new building, Arts West. I'd like to thank, of course, my colleagues in the Arts Faculty, also to Black Ink and State Library of Victoria for all the work they've done in organising this event, and particularly Tamsin and Courtney, wherever you are. Thank you, Tamsin. Tamsin is the Manager of Engagement within this faculty. Early in this reflection on the writing of Patrick White, Christos says, there are novels that in the reading enact a transformation that sees their characters and language become part of oneself, that literally challenge the way you look upon the world. If you are both a reader and a writer, then this transformation initiates the alchemy of inspiration, the structure that a great writer employs, their discipline, their control, and their fierce will to tell a story and create an imaginary world that resonates with the reality the reader inhabits, will inevitably become part of the way you wish to tell your own stories, and will influence the way you conjure your own imaginary words. I think that my colleagues Justine Hyde from State Library Victoria, Chris Fyfe, who can't be here from Black Ink because he's unwell, and my close colleague Meredith Martin from the University, who between them conjured this series of Writers on Writers, would agree that this alchemy of inspiration that Chris Tsiolkas describes here, between writer and reader, or between the writer and the writer as reader, that such an alchemy is exactly what we were trying to achieve with Writers on Writers. So thank you, Chris, for describing it so eloquently for us. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Justine Hyde, Director of Library Services and Experience at State Library Victoria, who will introduce our speakers this evening.
Thanks, Adrian. As Adrian said, my name is Justine Hyde. I'm the Director of Library Services and Experience at the State Library of Victoria. I'll be quick so we can get down to the business of hearing from Christos and Denise. But I'd just like to say that it's my absolute pleasure to represent the library at tonight's event, which celebrates something I think that's close to all of our hearts, and that's what it means to be a passionate reader and the power of literature to echo across time. As Adrian said, Writers on Writers is a collaboration between Black Ink, the State Library of Victoria and the University of Melbourne, and our three organisations share much in common, including a love of the written word, and a commitment to amplifying Australian voices. Writers on Writers was launched last year. This is the third book in the series, and if you haven't already read the other two, I'd encourage you to. So we've got Eric Jensen on Kate Jennings, which is a wonderful book, and also Alice Pung on John Marsden. And we've got three more coming soon, so look out for Kerridan Dovey on J.M. Coetzee, Nam Lee on David Malouf, and also Michelle de Kretser and Shirley Hazard. I think they all promise to be wonderful explorations of literature too. And we hope that these books spark new conversations about Australian literature and unearth original perspectives on some of our best loved writers. And I think Christos has definitely done that with Patrick White. Tonight we're celebrating two very distinctive voices in Australian writing as we present this third book in the series, which I said is Christos Tsiolkas, writing about an iconic Australian author, Patrick White, who was a novelist, playwright, and the only Australian winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature. Tonight we're going to follow Christos's year of reading Patrick White, his thoughts on White's impact on Australian language and culture, and his exploration of White as a writer and thinker. And Christos is, of course, a highly successful author in his own right. His novel The Slap won a Commonwealth Writers' Prize, was shortlisted for the 2009 Miles Franklin Award, and was longlisted for the 2010 Man Booker Prize, and has been also adapted for television. And his latest novel, the best-selling Barracuda, has been adapted for the screen, and his short story collection, Merciless Gods, was published to wide acclaim in 2014. Christos is also a playwright, essayist and screenwriter. So please welcome Christos. You're in the hot seat. You can come up too. And I'll also welcome Denise. She's going to lead the conversation tonight with Christos and the audience Q&A afterwards. Professor Denise Barney is Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Professor of Theatre Studies here at the University of Melbourne. Denise has been widely published in leading journals including Theatre Research International, and among her many books are Performance, Feminism and Effect in Neoliberal Times, Changing Environments in the Anthropocene, and The Dolls Revolution, Australian Theatre and Cultural Imagination. Please join me in welcoming both Denise and Christos.
Okay, well, we'll begin. Thank you very much. And we're here to talk about Christos on Patrick White. So I'm just going to begin with a conversation point and then just invite Christos to talk about that, and then we'll have about 30 minutes, and then there'll be some time for questions before we finish up. So if I may just begin, you refer in your book, you begin your book, in fact, with the question that was asked of you at an English literary festival in 2015 about what Australians think of Patrick White these days. And then you think about that, and then in your early chapter you talk about that you would like to nominate The Tree of Man, The Soul of Mandala and The Eye of the Storm as three of the greatest novels of the 20th century. And I think many of us will agree with that. And you write then so eloquently about the qualities of those novels and what that means for a writer to read that great literature. And as you say, you took a year off to read all of Patrick White's novels. So I'm going to just turn that around a little bit, because we can read your very eloquent words on the qualities of Patrick White's writing, and you talk about transformation and so on. But I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what makes them of their time and place, Australia in the 20th century. And you can take that in any direction that you like, just as a prompt.
I think I would say that one of the things that I discovered in I will call it a return to Patrick White. It wasn't that I had not read him previously in my life. I struggled through Voss in high school, as I think is not. I mean, is a lot of people have had that experience, and I gave up because I wasn't wise enough. I wasn't a good enough reader. I had, in my late teens, picked up the Arndt story, and we'll get to your question too.
That's okay.
And I struggled with that book as well. And then but I was a little bit older. It must have been 18, 19. I still remember the room I had in a shared household in Carlton when I started reading it. And I made a choice to start reading it aloud, because there was, particularly in that difficult later section when we were in Theodora's head, I wasn't getting it. And when I started reading it aloud, the language, the rhythms, the language came, the only word for it is that it came alive, and I understood something about what this man was doing. And one of the things he was doing was stretching the idea of what reading in the novel is. And I think that's a connection to the the great modernist tradition in the 20th century. And I didn't, that book will always remain pivotal in that understanding of what that tradition is. Because what it also teaches you is that, I mean, I had started reading from really, really early on. And so I completely understood the pleasure of reading and the immersion in different worlds and what language can do. But there is also a harder reading, a reading that takes certain knowledge and skill and work, and that is equally as rewarding. And the art story is my first introduction to how that reading occurs. So I would say reading him as a 20th century writer is acknowledging the absolute importance of the modernist works to what I do, what we do as writers, and how we work as readers. I'm very conscious, there's a couple of friends I haven't seen for a while. We did, a few years ago, we were in, it was only, 4 of us. We were in a reading group to do Ulysses, James Joyce, and it was the same, that's the same connection I'm making with reading Patrick White and the art story, that, you have to do work, and in the work you suddenly open up how you read. And the other thing, and why I love the Solid Mandala really, which I think is a novel that I think is imbued with such a deep humanism, but it's also a challenging novel for me, because it's kind of like it's about twins, and it's a mirror of two ways of being in the world, and one is lost and disconnected, and the other one is more in tune with nature, with something called the spiritual, which we don't have a language for. And so the other connection I would make with White is that he is a great existentialist. And because I was a student at this university in the 80s, that was a really dirty word. and it's not that I'm stopped being critical, but I understand now the absolute importance of that tradition as well, in what makes me a writer and makes me the person I am. So.
And I wonder if you could talk just a little bit more then about the Australian element of it, how that comes through to you. And of course, with writers on writers, it's actually also articulate the experience of reading writers. So there's the two perspectives there that you bring together.
I mean, that's. So I'm reading Patrick when I'm reading Patrick White. I'm reading him as a reader, but I'm certainly reading him as a writer as well, and what he's doing. So after I read the Ant Story, I had picked up. Memory's going to play me false, but I'd read the Twyborn Affair about that in those years. And then, under the influence of a certain kind of perspective on what literature was, and killing the dead white male, I didn't read Patrick White for a very long time until a few years ago, and I had picked up a second-hand copy of The Tree of Man. And what I found in reading that book is, yes, I think one of the greatest novels ever written. But also for me, I talk about it as being a sense of the first migrant story written in Australian literature.
I mean, that's so interesting. Could you expand on that?
I will try and make it coherent. I mean, one of the things I found in it was a kind of a sense of what you could call a settler story of the white fella who came to this land as part of that terrible colonial history. I could read it that way, but something in the language reminded me of Kazantzakis. Something in that language reminded me of Dostoevsky. Something in that language reminded me of that Russian literature, that Greek literature I love, and I was very curious about that. And I think that was the first time I thought, no one has told me this about White. Because I come from an immigrant background, so this is how my brain's working while I'm reading. And the first thing you do is you're just taken away by the story and the language and what White is achieving in being able to tell this origin story. But for me, I have been battling with that idea, firstly as a human being and as an Australian in this country, of what it means to be a non-Indigenous person in this country with its history. There's been a long period where there was kind of a demarcation between I'm not part of the Anglo-Celtic history. I'm another history, and somehow I stand outside the that terrible black-white relationship. I don't feel that anymore. I think that there is any of us, wherever we're from, who are not Indigenous, have to deal with the question of what it means to be Australian within that history, because that history is played out continuously. It is our present as much as our past. And Patrick White's The Tree of Man seemed to be the first book that reflected how I could enter the story of being an Australian. That's how much that book meant to me. And I say in the essay that it is the book that I wish my dad had lived long enough that I could have found a Greek translation of it.
Yes.
You know, because I think he would have responded to that story. Because it is a story of what it means to come to a new land, what it means to see the world anew. And I do think that one of the great, and this is a large part of, for me, the essay, is I think that there was something that Patrick White received, and I call it a gift, from his lover, Manolis Laskaris, which was a language in which to write the outsider. Patrick White was, I believe, already had that novelist gift of being able to see outside the self. I think him being a homosexual man in the 20th century, the early and mid 20th century, also gave him that attentiveness to what it means to be outsider. But I think what Manolis gave him was the migrant eye, to come back to this country and see it through the experience of someone who is a migrant, a refugee, who comes from the lost Ottoman world. And what he also, I think, gave Patrick White was a language to communicate the spiritual that comes from orthodoxy, which is not to say that I think Patrick White necessarily became a Christian, but, and I'm grateful for David Marr's biography for kind of illuminating that, but I made certain that I only read the biography after I finished reading all of White. But that I think because of his, of his conflicted feelings about being a bourgeois white man of his class and caste in Australia, a Protestant, there was something, he couldn't use that language, he couldn't use that tradition, but I think he could take something from orthodoxy. And so you read the first two novels, and I love Happy Valley, but it doesn't have that sense of the transcendent that I think is there onwards from his returning from World War II and his falling in love with Manoli. Sorry, that was really roundabout.
No, it's great. No, it's true. No, it's. I'm just reading from your book, just to bring you back. You say, I wish to purposefully unite two terms that continue to be separated in Australian culture: settlers and migrants. And I believe one of White's achievements is to link the pioneer experience of white Australia to the general history of migration to this country. And that I think that's very interesting. So that this settler is referring covertly to the English Anglo-Saxon tradition, and the migrant then to the non-English speaking tradition. And
I hope it's all right to say...
Condition of exile and all of that takes you back to Manoli as well. Manolis, yes.
And also that I hope this is, in order to explicate it, to make sense of it a bit, I was explaining to Denise, I've been in a theatre workshop with a group of people I worked with on a play, a company called Melbourne Workers Theatre 20 years ago. And we're doing a play together again now. And we were actually talking about the definition of whiteness, because 20 years ago, myself and Irini were considered not quite white. But history has changed, and now we are white people working on this play. And I guess I'm making that point because as history continues, that space between the settler and the migrant becomes one that I enter even more firmly as different. and that's why Patrick White is so important to me as a writer who is who understands that relationship. And as I said, I think it comes through Manoli.
And you also write about Greek Orthodoxy too. You say the one thread that connects Lascaris to the Greece I know from my family history, and one of the great gifts Manoli bestowed on his lover is the religion of Greek Orthodoxy. From his interviews, it becomes clear that Lascaris' devout faith cannot be divorced from his pride in the history of the religion. And you say that Orthodoxy is marked by a fatalism that separates it from Catholicism and Protestantism. And how that, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you say that really influenced Patrick White's sensibility that then comes through the novels.
I think one of the things that, I would hate to be saying that somehow Patrick White's greatness, and I will use that word as a writer, is dependent on Manolis Lascaris. I think the relationship's much more complex about that. And even right from the first stories and Happy Valley, you feel the sensuality that is an important part of White's writing and is often overlooked. But there is a restraint in those first two novels, particularly The Living and the Dead, which is the second novel, which is, I think, it reads to me as an Australian trying to write like an English person. I think we're all in the danger of doing sometimes, but I think that orthodoxy, and particularly the split that happened in the church, the Christian church, the Ottoman Empire, that separation. There is a tradition in orthodoxy of, and you certainly see it in Dostoevsky, you see it in someone like Kazantzakis, you see it in of that the sublime or Godhead is in nature, and it can be in our bodies, and it can be expressed in that mystical transcendent experience of being in the earth and of the earth. And I don't think Protestantism has that. And I think that's the language that I was astonished to read in The Tree of Man. And as I said, I felt like I was reading a Russian novel as much as I was reading an Australian novel.
And yet it's also, as you say, very much in the great tradition of the modernist 20th century novel. So you've got the reference to a very rich tradition, but also, combined with a modern existential sensibility as well, which makes it perhaps quite, some of the power of it resides in that combination.
Certainly. The thing that awes me as a writer myself is that someone like Patrick White was able to do that. One of the difficulties you have is trying to create fiction out of those influences, questions, relationships in your head without making it either didactic or dead on the page. How do you... that is the astonishing thing about reading White. How do you tell a history of white settlers in this country and make it as profound as reading the book of Job? How do you do that? It is a miracle for me, and I wish I had a language to explain that miracle, but maybe it's good that I don't. It's just that's what I'm responding to in White.
Shall we move on to then suburbia and elites? Patrick White is known as a satirist, and he wrote that incredibly excoriating piece, the Prodigal Son, talking about the suburbs and the Australians and their lack of consciousness and their sort of flickering consciousness. But as you say, that even though a satirist, and he's writing about suburbs, sarsaparilla and so on, Sydney, you find in them a great warmth and a great he finds, you say, a great warmth and a great humanity in the suburban locales. And I wonder if you'd like to talk a little bit about that. And I think that certainly in the plays you get a satirical representation of suburbia, but really what holds them together, I think, and I agree with you, is a warmth and a great humanity that's there, that just kind of flickers every now and again.
So, I mean, I think in a way to begin to answer that question, Denise, is to put up front for you all, you've got to acknowledge, some of the great power of the work is that he completely gets our parochialism, how we turn on each other, the narrowness of perspective that can be not only part of the this is what is astonishing for me about The Eye of the Storm, not only about our suburbs, but our inner cities, our elites. That's not only something that resides in suburbia. That's the thing that I believe Patrick White saw. And I think that's a graciousness that is often overlooked because he was a cantankerous man, and you read his non-fiction and his essays. He was so angry about the world, that narrow-mindedness, that parochialism, that meanness of spirit that he saw in Australia. I think it must have been incredibly difficult for him, that temptation for that generation to go to England or to go to America or to go elsewhere. And stay. I mean, that must have been a constant struggle for him. But I don't think he ever, I'm going to use the word grace. When you read something like The Solid Mandala, you look at Waldo, that is a novel that says, I'm actually finding great humanity right in the middle of the suburb. This is a man who has not left his world, his suburban rural world. And he has the greatest insight of what it means to be human, amongst any of his characters.
Jonathan Mills last night, Adrian was there and some of you may have been there, was talking about the adaptation of Voss into an opera. And as part of his talk, he made the point that had Patrick White become the expat, living in London, writing like an Englishman, he would never have become the writer that he did. Voss would never have happened, Tree of Man wouldn't have happened, and nor were then the developments on to Solid Mandala, Tyburn Affair, and so on.
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm really grateful, just as selfishly as a reader, that he stayed here. Also, I'm grateful selfishly as an Australian writer that he stayed here, because even though we say the cultural cringe is over, that notion of, I've certainly had it when I was a younger man, of leaving, that to be a real artist meant to be elsewhere. That seemed to, I remember really believing that, and that, so somehow the example of someone like White is incredibly important to us writers, I think. I don't know if you would agree, Helen. I'm sorry to put you on the spot. So it's that. The other thing, and we've talked about David Marr, the other book that I really am very grateful for is Vasilios Karelis, who is an academic, Australian academic, originally from Greece. He interviewed Manolios Laskaris in Manolios' later years. It's a series of interviews. And I write about this in the essay, but just very quickly, growing up as a gay man in this country, wanting to be a writer, loving literature, the other thing about White was that example, an openly homosexual couple, and one of them was a Greek Australian. That I was so. I was so fascinated by who these people were. But in my head, Manolios was like my father or my uncles, or like my mother or my aunts, really. And then I read these interviews, and you realise that he was actually an aristocratic man, from Anatolia, from a family that understood its lineage to go back right to the Byzantine kings. So very different Greek to the one I was imagining. But what I think this dissolving, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and taught Manolis, and I think got communicated to Patrick White, was that home could go, being scattered was part of the human experience, and I think that's in the novels as well. And that I think I can only. I'm gleaning this from David Marr's work. I'm gleaning this from the interviews with Lascaris. I'm gleaning this from my own life and what it, there's something about the loyalty of love that I think kept Patrick White here, that made him a great writer. And I wanted to be respectful to that in this essay as well. And
you acknowledge, of course, too, towards the end, that he's accused of misogyny and misanthropy. And to get back to that question, what do Australians think of Patrick White? Is the arch misogynist and misanthrope?
Look, I'm assuming so many of you know Patrick White. You can't read The Eye of the Storm. You can't read The Aunt Story. You can't read Writers in the Chariot. You can't read those short stories and believe that. And I think that if there are two points in the essay that I had to really think through, was the question of white being white and what that means as a writer, and demanding of myself that I be critical, but be critical in good faith. I talked about this with friends the other day, that I think you can be critical, but critical out of a respect of what White was trying to do in something like Riders in the Chariot. I don't like, and I would say that if you come from a position of bad faith where you are seeking misogyny and you are seeking racism and you are seeking misanthropy, then I would be distrustful of that critical reading. And I think that was the critical reading that I, as a foolish young man, was doing with Patrick White.
Informed by voices that were not necessarily your own.
Look, maybe it was it was. I was saying to Denise earlier, I started here at this institution. I was 17 years old. I was so excited to come at university. I was so bloody nervous about it. And of course I signed up to do English, because that's what I thought I would be the greatest delight. And within 2 weeks, I left. I just went, I'm out of this course, and I signed up to do history, which I'm really, really glad I did. And it was because in those 2 weeks, I realised that if I stayed on doing English at that time, I would have forgotten what was the joy that brought me to the novel. I'm sorry that
So you're saying that Patrick White has survived postmodernism,
yes,
and post-structuralism,
yes. And so have I.
Okay.
Sorry, Denise. I'm going to be really, just because it's important to say this. I've dedicated this book to Jaroslav Havir, who was my English teacher in Year 9 and in HSC, and he was from Czechoslovakia. He was a man who he understood that I loved reading, but he wanted me to read more, and he wanted me to read the books he loved, and he loved French literature. I'm saying, he gave me Stendhal. He gave me Flaubert, he gave me Gide. So he set me on my way. And there was a great passion and love for what reading and literature could do. And I am so fortunate that I had that to steer me through these. Don't get me wrong, it's not that I don't feel, it's not that I didn't. I learned certain ways to be critical. through that engagement with postmodernism. But I feel like I failed myself, that younger man, by turning away from certain writings, from certain ways of reading that would have held me in good stead as a writer and as a reader. So I'm very grateful for Mr. Javier for setting me on that path.
One more conversation point and then questions. Just riffing from that, in terms of literary value, Ben, and the inspiration. Could you just talk a little bit about the literary values that have inspired you the most in terms of Patrick White's language, his writing, his words?
I think and again, this runs counter to the notion of the misanthrope that we have about the public persona of Patrick White. The deep humanity and understanding of what it is to be outside in a culture. And you know, though it's not my favourite of his books, something like Riders in the Chariot, which, you know, I grapple with what he's doing in the book, and part of that grappling is the politics and reading it from the 21st century and what he's doing. But then also the miracle that is Alf Dubbo, that I think is a great character, who's an Aboriginal character, who is a hero and anti-hero, I call him. You know, that was achieved by Patrick Wright in that representation, in creating that character, in creating the humanity of that character. And I also think for the other, if I was to think about it, Denise, I guess, I don't know how this will influence the writing that comes up, you know, that I do now, but to be reminded that there is something in a spiritual language that I want to not jettison, that has been part of, maybe the word spiritual is the wrong one because of of history, but that there's something in describing our relationship to each other and something about communicating our relationship to all that is the world, that language makes possible. Yes. You know.
Yes. Well said, well said. Okay, thank you, Christos.
Thank you,
for being so generous.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.